Welcome everybody to this Astranti financial training video for the November 2018 strategic case study on Novak pharmaceuticals. And this is the real world industry analysis. So what we're going to be looking at in this video is the pharmaceutical industry in which Novak is operating. And we're going to get a good understanding of the way in which the industry has evolved to become the industry we know as today. And we'll look at some of the key issues and factors impacting on the industry at present, as well as looking forward to some of the key issues and trends are likely to impact on the industry in the future. But it's useful first up to have a look at why getting a good understanding of the industry is so important. And in order to do that, it's useful to look back at the March 2015 examiners report, which states that the examiners expect you to have excellent knowledge of the pre-scene industry. So we can see very clearly that having good industry awareness, understanding the context in which the pre-scene company is set, is so important, and how that relates to your role as a senior manager at Novak Pharmaceuticals. And so in this analysis, we will be consistently linking the issues and the factors that are impacting on the industry back to the pre-scene company and back to your role as a senior manager at Novak. So first and foremost then, to start up, it's useful to get a good introduction to the pharmaceutical industry. And we'll start by looking at the history. We won't spend too long on this, but it's good to get some context and to understand how the industry has evolved to become one of the most profitable, innovative, and influential industries in the world today. So the industry as we know it is a global industry. It's dominated by a number of multinational, huge corporations operating across the globe. And these companies are at the cutting edge, are at the forefront, the pinnacle of science and technology. And they're earning huge revenues and huge profits. But the origins of the pharmaceutical industry date back thousands and thousands of years. And actually, the first records of natural substances being used for their medicinal effects can be found as early as the 28th century BC. And this is important because what it shows us is that there has been a demand, there's been a market, so to speak, for medicinal products, for pharmaceuticals, for thousands and thousands of years. And even though science and technology have come on such a long way and the products today are hugely complex and much more advanced than the medicinal products that are being used thousands of years ago, some of the products that are available today have their roots thousands of years ago. So for example, if we take cenopods and castor oil, they were first used by the Egyptians, but they are the basis of some products that can still be bought in pharmacies around the world today. So we can see that the pharmaceutical industry, the use of medicinal products, goes back thousands of years. But actually, it's the 16th and 17th century where we begin to see a more scientific application of chemistry, and the pharmaceutical industry began to take shape. And it's where we first started to see some formalization, some standardization. So we've got the first list of drugs and medicinal compounds, which formalized the way in which substances were being produced. And we've also got pharmacies being identified as distinct and separate entities for the first time. So building on this standardization then in the 18th and 19th century is where we begin to see many companies start to take shape. So during this period, we see the move away from local apothecaries making botanical drugs towards a more large wholesale drugs manufacturing environment. And actually many modern day companies, including Merck, Roche, GlaxoSmithKline, all have their origins in local apothecary shops in the mid-1800s. And the pharmaceutical industry at this time also benefited hugely from scientific advancements in other fields. So, for example, we had Swiss and German dye manufacturers who were successful at isolating and synthesizing chemicals, and this knowledge was used by pharmaceutical companies in chemically producing drugs on a mass scale for the first time. And actually, during this period, we had the first sedative being produced, the first antipyretic, and aspirin, which we can still buy today. Okay, so during that period, then we began to see companies forge their place in the market. We saw more scientific advancements being made, but it's the 1900s to the 1990s where we see an acceleration in scientific advancements. We also saw an increased globalization, improved methods of production, so mass production techniques which were originally used by American car manufacturers were now being used across multiple different industries, including pharmaceuticals, and effectively it began to emerge as a large and complex enterprise. And this was also the first time where we saw the joining together of medical, chemical, and biological research. We saw non-for-profit organizations and governments coming together with different institutions in the pharmaceutical industry to accelerate the advancement of pharmaceuticals. And during this time, we saw things like the isolation of insulin for the first time, which is still used today to treat diabetes. And we also had the discovery of penicillin, so the first effective antibiotic. So we can see that all of these things contributed greatly to the advancement of science and technology and pharmaceuticals. But actually, there was also a huge amount of social and economic change in this century which massively shaped the industry. And one of the key social changes was the arrival of social healthcare systems. So we've got the example here of the NHS in the UK, and this created a much more structured system for prescription drugs, and importantly for pharmaceutical companies for their reimbursement. And what this essentially meant was that pharmaceutical companies could gain a reasonable return on investment, and it incentivized them investing in new pharmaceuticals. So effectively, this period was characterized by the marrying together of new production techniques, of social and economic change, and scientific advancements. And all of those things contributed to some of the most notable pharmacological developments of the 20th century. So we've got some examples here. And for the first time, drugs were being produced to treat disorders which previously had no known therapeutic cures. Okay, so we can now see that the industry as a whole is really taking shape. But it's the late 1990s, the early 2000s, where big pharma really began to take shape. And that's the way we describe the industry today, where it's dominated by a number of extremely large corporations. And essentially they grew to this size and this prominence through a number of mergers and acquisitions. And so this resulted in the industry being dominated by huge multinational corporations operating across the globe, and they had increasing amounts of research and development expenditure. And so essentially the industry became defined by a number of large corporations with huge amounts of resources. Now, in recent years, this approach has started to change. So these companies are now looking to streamline and refine their business models and become more focused. So more focused on certain therapeutic areas, or by divesting areas of their company that aren't exclusively pharmaceuticals. And we've got some examples here, but we won't go through all of these now, but it's useful to become familiar with some certain examples of companies that have taken this approach. Okay, so we know how the industry has grown to become the way it is today. What about the future? What is likely to impact on the way in which the pharmaceutical companies are going to evolve? Well, technology, specifically biotechnology and computing, are helping to refine techniques in the development, discovery, and production of drugs. And the reason this is important is because it's accelerating the rate at which breakthroughs are occurring. Companies are always looking for ways to speed up the research and development phase to get drugs to market as soon as possible. It's also important not to overlook the fact that the pharmaceutical industry and the advancement of pharmaceutical companies and technology is not just for the benefit of those big companies, it's for the benefit of society. It's for the benefits of patients who are going to be using these drugs in order to help treat and cure diseases. And the rate at which breakthroughs are occurring, getting quicker, can only be a good thing for society. So we can see the way in which the industry is expected to evolve. We know that in the end of 2017, the market was estimated to be worth 1.11 trillion, which is huge, but even bigger is the projected market value in 2020, which is 1.43 trillion. So we can see the market is expected to massively increase over the next 2 years. So why does this matter? What does this mean for Novak Pharmaceuticals then? Well, it's interesting to note the fact that Novak, like many other companies in the industry, has its roots in the early 19th century. So we know it started with an apothecary shop in the 19th century, and that's the same as companies like Merck, Roche, Eli Lilly. And the reason this is so important is because these companies have a strong, reputable brand and rich, prestigious history. And this is good because it helps when looking to recruit new talent and also when pitching innovations and products to the medical profession. So these are two issues which we know from the precedent are really important to Novak. Their reputation is of vital importance. It's a vital factor in maintaining competitive advantage and when appealing to future investors and future customers. Now, another important point that the history of the pharmaceutical industry raises in relation to Novak is the pursuit of growth through acquisitions. We can see that many of the leading companies in the industry today have pursued aggressive merger and acquisition strategies, and we know that this is also true of Novak, and they continue to pursue this strategy today. And the important point when thinking about the future of the industry especially is the fact that in recent years, merger and acquisition strategies by the big pharmaceutical firms have tended to focus on acquiring smaller companies that lie outside of the pharmaceutical sphere, so companies that are operating in the tech industry, for example. And this is a trend going forwards which might be applicable to Novak and something they might be looking to do to diversify their portfolio, to strengthen their technological and scientific advancement by acquiring a small tech company, for example. Now, another key theme running throughout the history of the industry is the impact of research and development. It's pretty much the lifeblood of the industry. It's key to the success of the big corporations. And companies like Novak, with reputations as being innovators, need to look to capitalize on new manufacturing techniques, new technologies, new innovative therapies. So continuing to research and develop, but taking note of the new ways in which this is being done in order to be successful. So looking to the future then, we've talked briefly about how Novak may wish to continue their M&A strategy, maybe acquiring small tech startups, for example. They might also look to reduce their M&A activity and embrace a leaner and more streamlined business model, which is something we've seen among some of the larger companies in recent years, looking to focus on specific therapeutic areas, for example, and establish themselves as leaders in a specific field. Okay, so we've got a good understanding now of the industry, some of the key trends that throughout history have been evident and continue to impact on the industry today. The next thing it's important to have a good insight into is the range of products that are available. And we'll quickly touch on the fact that there are a number of different pharmaceutical products, and they come in a variety of different forms, and we can classify them in many different ways. But what we are most interested in for this case study is the different types, and specifically in the case of Novak, we are interested in innovative pharmaceuticals. So those are those chemically derived pharmaceuticals developed through extensive R&D activities, and they are importantly the first drugs containing a specific active ingredient. So what this means is that the company that develops them is the first company to identify that compound, that active ingredient, to treat a specific condition. And the manufacturer, the company that develops them, then rely extremely heavily on getting patent protection. And the reason that they depend so heavily on this is because when the patent is enforced during that patent period, other companies cannot make or sell the same drug. So essentially what this means is they have exclusivity. It's a major form of competitive advantage. Now, the patent normally lasts for around 20 years. There are some extensions that can occur to the patent if you can prove it has use in pediatrics, so if you can use it on children, or if you can prove it has use for another specific condition, if you slightly alter the use of the medication. But generally after around 20 years, patent protection expires, and that is when generics become competitors. So generics are copies of innovator pharmaceuticals, and you can only produce them after the expiry of the innovator drug patent. And they are essentially identical. So they've got the same ingredients, they're identical in strength, they're identical in dosage, and they're identical in the way in which they're given to the patient. But the key difference here is that they tend to be produced in much higher volumes, and crucially, they tend to be produced at a much lower cost. So the companies manufacturing these generics don't have to cover the research and development costs that the big pharmaceutical company who have developed the drug have to account for. So this means they are much cheaper to produce and also much cheaper for consumers to buy. So there are two types of generics we just want to touch on briefly. We've got commodity generics, which are sold under their chemical name, manufactured by more than one company, and very price competitive. But we've also got branded generics, essentially exactly the same as the commodity generics, except they're sold under a company's label, and that means they typically are sold for higher prices. So think of things like Nurofen and Sudafed. They're sold under a brand name, which means that you pay more for them despite the fact they are exactly the same as a commodity generic also on the market. Okay, so the products we've talked about so far are chemically derived products, but increasingly we're seeing companies move towards producing biologics. So we also know these as biopharmaceuticals, and they're products which are derived from living materials. So this is things like vaccines, blood components, tissues, therapeutic proteins. And although they're much more expensive to produce and much more complex, they're proving increasingly important in the treatment of conditions like cancer and autoimmune disorders. So more and more companies are looking towards biologics as a potential market to enter into. Biosimilars are effectively the generic versions of biologics, but because the nature of biopharmaceutical production is so complex, it means that any small change in the manufacturing process can actually have a massive impact on the finished product. So gaining regulatory approval for biosimilars can be long and costly. So that means that in the end, biosimilars don't end up being that much cheaper than the patented counterpart. So biologics and biosimilars are actually fairly similar in price. Okay, so far all of the drugs that we've talked about are pharmaceutical drugs which require a prescription in order to purchase. So you need to have authorization from a medical professional essentially before you can purchase them. But there are also a range of pharmaceuticals that can be bought without a prescription, and these we refer to as over-the-counter or OTC medications. These tend to be much safer products, much cheaper products produced in much higher volumes, and it might even be the case that over time certain prescription drugs become OTC medications after they've proved to be quite safe or appropriate for over-the-counter usage. Okay, so the next type of product we're going to look at are orphan drugs. And essentially an orphan drug is a pharmaceutical product which is developed to treat an orphan disease, which essentially is a very, very rare disease which affects a very small amount of the population. Now, the number of patients that have these orphan diseases by nature is very, very small. So the market size for pharmaceutical companies is very small. And that means that historically they've not been a high priority. But there are various legal and financial incentives which have been introduced by governments and different funding bodies because they're becoming increasingly concerned with finding ways to treat these specific diseases. And examples of legislation that's come in are the 1983 Orphan Drug Act in the US and the 1999 legislation in the European Parliament, which essentially provides the pharmaceutical companies with some incentive to produce the product. So for example, we've got a 10-year market exclusivity extension for companies who are producing drugs which are targeting these orphan diseases. Now, all of the products we've touched on so far are pharmaceutical products, so they represent the finished pharmaceutical which is used by the patient. But we also have companies operating in the industry who focus exclusively on producing the active pharmaceutical ingredients, so the APIs, which means they focus specifically on producing the chemical compounds, but they don't necessarily produce the end product. They're just responsible for synthesizing the chemicals and producing the compounds which give the drug its effective nature. We also have companies that produce just the excipients. So these are those substances which effectively give the product their form. So it could be any flavorings or additives which go into producing a syrup so that it's better in terms of its taste and its odor. Now, it's important to note that these companies also have to comply with the same regulations as companies that are producing the finished product. So the APIs and the excipients need to be at a certain standard. Now, as well as producing pharmaceutical products, some pharmaceutical companies also offer other products, and this can benefit them in terms of their marketing and their distribution strategies. And different products that they might offer include things like vials, needles, syringes, so things to actually administer the drugs, as well as other things like home monitoring devices, which are effectively ways for patients to measure things like blood sugar levels, for example, which can be effective in allowing a patient to understand when they need to take certain medication, for example. So those are all the different types, and briefly it's important to touch on the fact that we can also class pharmaceutical products by their therapeutic area. So the reason this is so important is because in the industry at the moment, many companies are looking to carve their niche in certain therapeutic areas. And there are some areas where the market share is increasing. So if we look at 2017, for example, we can see that oncology was the largest market area in that year. It had a massive 11.7% of the market was oncology. And it's useful for companies to be aware of this because, as we saw earlier, for example, it's biopharmaceuticals which are proving to be extremely effective in treating certain cancers. So as we can see, if oncology is holding a large amount of the market share and it's increasing in size, for example, then this is an area that a company may wish to look at carving a role in the industry. So as well as understanding the different types of products, it's useful to see how trends in the market is developing. And one of the areas which is growing is orphan drugs. So these are those drugs that are used to treat these incredibly rare conditions. And we're actually expecting that the market for orphan drugs is going to double by 2022. Another area which is growing is generics. So people are constantly looking at cheaper ways to biopharmaceutical products. There's been a lot in the media about high profit margins, high markups. We've seen how expensive pharmaceutical products can be. So generics is a growing market, especially as the number of originator drugs losing patent protection in 2022 is quite large, and emerging markets with less disposable income are looking for ways to cut healthcare costs. So as we've said, generics are a cheaper alternative, so the market is expected to grow. And we can see that total prescription drug sales are expected to increase quite rapidly over the next 6 years, with quite a lot of this increase attributable to a growth in both orphan and generics drugs, which we can see here. Now, another trend that pharmaceutical companies need to be aware of is the growth in biologics and biosimilars. And we actually estimate that by 2020, biologics are going to make up more than a quarter of the pharmaceutical market. But it's important to note that in those intervening years, so in the years between now and 2020, many of the products that are coming off patent are biologics. So when we combine this fact along with the fact that biologics are very expensive and very hard to access, it's likely that we'll see a big drive in the growth of biosimilars, especially in emerging markets who are constantly looking for ways to reduce their healthcare expenditure. Now, as well as the biosimilars market growing because of this, it's likely that the growth in this biosimilars market could incite a growth in the biologics market. It will push industries operating in that market to look at new innovative ways to produce drugs to maintain market share. And so there also is the potential that biologics are going to grow as well. And the reason that biopharmaceutical products are just continuing to grow is the fact that they are able to address conditions which were previously thought of as untreatable. So we've talked about their use in autoimmune diseases, and we've talked about their use in cancer treatment, for example. And we can see here some key statistics which show just how lucrative these products are to the companies that produce them. Okay, so what does all of this mean for Novak then? Well, we know from the pre-scene that Novak focuses exclusively on developing and manufacturing pharmaceutical drugs. So we know they don't manufacture generics other than the products that they had previously developed and now have lost their patent protection. And essentially what they look to do is to manufacture the chemical compound that's been identified. So this means they're a company that relies very, very heavily on patent protection and intellectual property. So from the pre-scene, we believe that Novak focuses exclusively on those chemically derived drugs. But by looking at the industry, we can see there's actually an increasing trend for biopharmaceutical products. This is a really lucrative area that's likely to continue to grow, and actually if they want to maintain their strong industry presence and they want to maintain their reputation as innovators, it's an area where Novak may wish to look in the future and capitalize on the growth in this market whilst it's still in a maturing phase, whilst it hasn't reached market saturation, while there's still room for companies to enter the market and to forge and to carve out a reputation within the market. And another area which we can see from the pre-scene is prominent in Cronland, where we know Novak is based, is the growth of orphan drugs. So we can see from the media excerpt here that orphan diseases are discussed at a summit in Cronland, which effectively is showing us that there's a global demand for these products. The demand is also growing, and the way in which pharmaceutical companies are being incentivized and compelled to enter this market is through government legislation, through provision of funding, and through increased patent protection. So Novak shouldn't overlook the potential of producing orphan drugs because it could prove to be a lucrative market in the future. Okay, so we've got a good understanding now of how the pharmaceutical industry has evolved throughout its history, and we know all of the different types of products that a pharmaceutical company may produce. The next thing it's useful to look at are the customers and the ways in which pharmaceutical companies market to them. Now, for this industry, it's important that we start by making a clear distinction between the customers, who are the people buying the products, and the end users of the product, so those who end up using and benefiting from them. Now, the end users of pharmaceutical products are the patients, but the customers, the people who are actually buying the products, are the regulators, the payers, so that's insurance companies and healthcare providers, and the prescribers. And the pharmaceutical industry is fairly atypical in that, unlike other industries where you might identify your customer base according to their age, their gender, or their social standing, disposable income, for example, identifying customers in the pharmaceutical industry is more about looking at how prevalent a certain disease is, or the geographic location in which the patient is in, and can the country that they live in afford to pay to prevent, treat, and cure their illness? Effectively, can they afford the pharmaceutical products? Now, we know that pharmaceuticals is a global business, and this is really nicely shown on the breakdown of the pharmaceutical market in 2017. We can see that pharmaceuticals are sold across the globe, so predominantly the largest markets are found in North America and in Europe, as well as in Japan and China. So we can see that the market for pharmaceuticals really is global. But a key distinction between these markets in terms of their geography needs to be drawn between the developed markets. So this is countries in North America, Asia Pacific, and Western Europe, which, because of their high per capita spending rates on healthcare, are the major markets for pharmaceutical companies at the moment. And it's actually expected that the growth rates in these countries is going to continue to increase, but the rate at which it does so is going to slow down. So the growth rates are going to be lower than they have been in the past. And there are a number of different reasons for this. There's the stagnating national economies, the likelihood that regulations are going to get tighter. There's a number of patents which are due to expire in these countries in the coming years, and governments are putting increasing pressure on pharmaceutical companies to deliver value for money. So actually, it's the developing markets, so emerging markets in Asia, Africa, South and Central America, where pharmaceutical sales are forecasting to grow at increased rates. And there is a huge amount of potential for pharmaceutical companies who are going to begin to operate more and more in these emerging markets. But it has to be noted that in order to be successful, companies are going to have to establish new sales techniques, new marketing and pricing strategies in order to account for some of the political, cultural, social and religious differences that they're going to see in these countries. And developing nations differ to developing nations in many different ways. And we've got some examples of factors that healthcare providers and pharmaceutical companies need to be aware of when they're looking to expand their offering into these developing markets. And as well as these hurdles, there's also the likelihood that they're going to face increased competition from manufacturers within these nations, and protectionist measures and trade barriers as well, as the governments within these countries are going to look at ways of boosting their own domestic industries. Okay, so we've seen how geographically diverse the market is. It's a global industry, but each country's market is likely to be different. And one of the key differences that you're going to come across time and time again is a hugely divisive ethical issue, as well is the pricing differences between countries. So some countries have a publicly funded healthcare system, and we know, for example, that the UK has a pharmaceutical price regulation scheme which makes sure that their National Health Service can purchase drugs at reasonable prices. So they're negotiated by a Department of Health working on behalf of the government, and they're associated by an industry body working on behalf of pharmaceutical manufacturers. And we know that publicly funded healthcare systems have limited budgets. They need to make choices on the way in which they can most effectively allocate their resources, where they should be putting their money. So in the UK, for example, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, who are called NICE, they play an important role in reviewing drugs from the perspective of cost effectiveness. And effectively, if any drug is expected to cost more than £20,000 to £30,000 per year of quality life, then it's deemed too expensive, and essentially it won't be authorised for use. So companies have an incentive to make drugs cost effective, because effectively they don't want to spend all of this money in the research and development phases to have a drug refused for use on the basis that it's too expensive. So the UK is an example of a national healthcare service where drug pricing is regulated. But actually there are some countries, and one example is the United States, so one of the most wealthy countries in the world, where drug prices are actually unregulated, and instead they're determined by negotiations between drug companies and insurance companies. And we can see the impact that this can have on the different prices of drugs here. We've got the UK, for example, where we know there's a National Health Service, and their price for this specific medication in this example is 98 cents per drug. Now, if we compare that to the price for the same drug in the United States, where there is no price regulation, the drug costs $6.83. So we can see that is a huge difference. That's 7 times as much for the drug in the United States. And that's a key divisive issue. How can drug companies justify prices being that different across the world? And it's also a major factor when we consider developing nations. We know these are the markets that are going to be developing, but affordability is becoming a key factor in limiting patients' access to pharmaceuticals. And it's even more prominent when we consider the fact that up to 90% of populations in developing countries actually need to purchase these medicines through out-of-pocket payments, which means it's not through a healthcare service, it's not through an insurance provider, it's just coming out of their weekly wages, for example. So we can see that pricing is a divisive issue, but the pharmaceutical industry is actually somewhat unique, because in this case, as we've talked about before, the end user isn't the same as the customer. And in this case, the end user, who is the patient, has absolutely no power over the pricing. And the prescriber, who's actually prescribing the drugs, who's actually authorizing the sale of these drugs, isn't allowed to profit from the sale of the drugs under ethical guidelines, which means that the only people with any negotiating power are the pharmacies and the medical institutions that essentially fulfill the prescriptions. So effectively, the end users don't have a huge amount of power. But it could be argued that actually in recent years, in light of a number of negative media headlines where the pricing disparity of some drugs across the world and the huge margins and markups that are being achieved by a number of pharmaceutical companies has come to light, there's an increasing amount of pressure from consumers and from legislators to control healthcare costs. So there's more of an emphasis on pharmaceutical industries to provide value for money. And we'll talk a bit more about pricing later when we go through the ethics involved in pharmaceuticals. Now, we've talked about the fact that the general public has little power over the pharmaceutical industry, so they don't influence the prices or the products that they make. But any growth that we can see in the population has an impact on the composition of the population, and that in turn will essentially guide and direct the types of products that a pharmaceutical company is producing, as well as the prices they're able to sell them for. So, for example, as a company grows, the disease profiles of the company change. So life expectancy is expected to increase. urbanization is going to increase, infrastructure improves, so the diseases that the pharmaceutical companies are producing products to fight, the prices that governments, payers and patients are going to pay, that is all going to change. So we've got some figures here which show that the global population is expected to increase by 1.24% every year until 2030. And that means that there's going to be an increase in the aging population. So we can see here there's going to be a 6% rise in the number of 65 to 80-year-olds. And when we couple this with the growing urbanization, the growing middle class, this means that drugs are going to become more available and more affordable. So we can see how all of these factors are going to change the demand for certain medications, are going to change the prices that people are able to pay for them, and it's going to change the therapeutic areas that are dominating the market. So how does all of this apply to Novak then? Well, we know from the pre-scene Novak has a large global sales force. And when we combine this with the complex regulatory landscape that we know the pharmaceutical industry operates in, we can see that the customers that Novak are targeting their products towards vary hugely depending on the country they are in. And so actually the ability for Novak to adapt their strategy accordingly needs to be in place, and having a global sales force with presence in all of these different countries is going to go some way to being able to gauge the pharmaceutical market needs in that country, the specific products that need to be produced, as well as the affordability of the products to that country's population. Now, another factor that we need to think about when we're thinking about customers is pricing. And if we consider Cronland, for example, where we know that Novak is based, we know they've got a CHS, so Cronland Health Service, which we can compare to the National Health Service in the UK. And we know that the CRS has a pharmaceutical review agency, the PRA. And we're told that they review all their drugs from the perspective of cost effectiveness. And we know this is a role that's fulfilled by NICE for the NHS in the UK. We discussed the pricing regulation in a country where they have a nationalised healthcare system. And we know that these bodies have the ability to refuse or purchase drugs on the basis of cost effectiveness. So this is showing that in some countries in which Novak is operating, there is a level of customer power, and they need to be aware of this when they're developing pricing strategies in specific countries. So I hope you enjoyed that sample of the SCS industry analysis video, but before we end, there are a couple of other products that we at Astranti provide that I'd like to draw your attention to, which we believe will be hugely beneficial for you in your preparation for the case study exam and give you the best chance of passing. So we offer 2 study texts which provide key pieces of advice geared towards passing the case study. So we've got study text 1, which covers your role, how to analyse the pre-scene, exam preparation, writing approach and time management advice, as well as study text 2, which summarises the most commonly examined topics from the OT exams. And we've also got a full set of course videos which show you what it takes to pass the exam. So again, we talk about planning and writing advice and how the case study is marked. Now we've got a full range of pre-scene analysis materials, and these pick out key information from the pre-scene, apply the key theories and models to the pre-scene scenario, and highlight the top 10 issues likely to come up in your case study. Now, we've seen it's really important you can show you have fully understood the pre-scene industry and apply all of that knowledge in the exam. And so the industry document and video essentially provide you with the tools to do this. Now, we also provide mock exams which are tailored to the pre-scene based on the topics most likely to appear in your exam, and we provide additional marking and feedback which will allow you to see your strengths and your weaknesses and get advice from a CIMA tutor on how you can improve. Now, our masterclasses are a live online study environment and they're fully interactive, and this allows you to ask questions and clarify your understanding. And because we believe that our case study course contains everything you need to pass your exam, we have a pass guarantee. So essentially, if you get to results day and you haven't passed, but you've purchased and completed our full course, then we will enroll you on the next course free of charge as part of our pass guarantee. So you can see we offer a huge range of materials, all designed to maximise your chances of passing the exam. So head over to our website and check out what we have to offer. Thank you very much. Bye bye.